Something shifted between the world wars, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the quiet inevitability of consensus forming in closed rooms. In the 1840s, when Layard first shipped tablets from Mesopotamia to London, scholars approached them with straightforward curiosity. What did these ancient texts say? George Smith, working in the British Museum's cramped offices in the 1870s, translated the Epic of Gilgamesh and presented what he found. Accounts of pre-flood rulers, beings who descended from the sky, knowledge given to early humans by those who came before. His translations made headlines. The public was fascinated. Academic journals published his work without controversy. Through the late 1800s and early 1900s, Assyriologists treated Anunnaki references as they would any historical claim, something to be investigated, debated, tested against other evidence. The tablets were catalogued as historical records. Museums displayed them alongside other ancient documents. University courses taught them as windows into early Mesopotamian civilization. Papers were published regularly. Between 1918 and 1935, over 200 academic articles discussed the Anunnaki, exploring various interpretations of who they were and what their presence in the tablets meant. Scholars disagreed, certainly, but the disagreements were considered legitimate scholarly debate. Then the pattern changed. Between 1935 and 1950, only 12 papers about the Anunnaki appeared in major journals. The tablets themselves hadn't changed. Thousands still sat in museum archives, the cuneiform as readable as ever. But the academic conversation simply stopped. What happened in those intervening years was subtle but total. Archaeology professionalized. Standards emerged. Peer review processes formalized. Funding structures centralized. None of this was sinister in itself. These were normal institutional developments, but they had an effect. New translation methodologies appeared that prioritized cultural context over literal reading. Scholars began interpreting ancient texts not by what they actually said, but by what ancient people supposedly must have meant. The assumption became that ancient humans thought in purely mythological terms, so any text that seemed to describe physical events must actually be symbolic. Compare translations from different eras, and you'll see the shift in real time. A cuneiform phrase that Louis Spence translated in 1880 as "those who from heaven came to earth" appears in a 1932 textbook as the gods of heaven and earth. Same symbols, different interpretation. The physical arrival becomes abstract divinity. The concrete becomes metaphorical. By the 1940s, this reinterpretation was complete. The Anunnaki were officially mythological figures, divine beings from religious texts, symbols of natural forces or psychological archetypes. Anyone who continued to read the tablets literally found themselves outside the new consensus. Funding structures reinforced the change. Archaeological excavations became expensive, requiring institutional backing. Independent scholars who lacked university affiliation lost access to dig sites and archives. The few institutions wealthy enough to sponsor major excavations naturally favored researchers whose interpretations aligned with established frameworks. Peer review, meant to ensure quality, became a mechanism for enforcing orthodoxy. Journal editors were drawn from the same small pool of senior scholars. These editors selected reviewers from among their own students and colleagues. Papers that challenged consensus interpretations were rejected, not because of factual errors, but because of methodological concerns or insufficient engagement with established scholarship. Canonical interpretations emerged, standard readings that appeared in textbook after textbook, referenced in paper after paper, until they became simply what everyone knows. Alternative readings didn't need to be actively suppressed. They just needed to be ignored long enough to fade from active discussion. This wasn't unique to Sumerian studies. The same pattern appeared in Egyptology, where earlier scholars' literal interpretations of pyramid texts gave way to purely symbolic readings. In Mesoamerican archaeology, where accounts of civilizing culture heroes were reclassified as mythology. In biblical scholarship, where historical claims were increasingly treated as theological literature, the synchronization is striking. Across multiple fields, dealing with different cultures and different texts, the same shift happened in the same decades. Literal interpretations became unfashionable. Symbolic readings became orthodox. Physical possibilities became mythological impossibilities. The institutions involved would deny coordination. They'd point to independent scholarly judgment, evolving methodologies, improved understanding of ancient cultures. But the result was coordinated regardless of intention. A wholesale reinterpretation of humanity's oldest texts, all moving in the same direction, all arriving at the same conclusion. The Anunnaki were not historical. They could not be historical. Therefore, any text suggesting they were historical must be read differently. The tablets didn't change. The narrative about the tablets did. Knowledge is controlled not through dramatic censorship, but through quiet management of access and authority. The story of how Anunnaki research was contained is a story of gates and gatekeepers. A relatively small number of institutions hold most of the world's cuneiform tablets. The British Museum houses perhaps the largest collection. The University of Pennsylvania's Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology holds tens of thousands more. The Louvre, the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. These few institutions possess the primary sources. This creates natural bottlenecks. If you want to study original tablets, you need access to these collections. Access requires credentials, institutional affiliation, and often personal connections with collection curators. Independent researchers face polite but firm barriers. Within these institutions, certain individuals accumulated extraordinary influence. They sat on editorial boards of major journals. They led the most prestigious excavations. They trained the next generation of scholars. They determined whose papers got published, whose grant applications succeeded, whose interpretations were considered serious scholarship. The Deutsche Orientgesellschaft in Germany, the British Museum's Department of the Ancient Near East, the Oriental Institute at Chicago. These weren't shadowy organizations. They were respected academic institutions, but they functioned as choke points where interpretations could be standardized and alternative readings filtered out. Consider how academic careers work. Young scholars need publications to advance. Journals are controlled by editorial boards. Those boards select peer reviewers, typically from among established scholars who share similar methodological assumptions. Papers challenging those assumptions get rejected, not because they're wrong, but because they're outside current scholarly frameworks. A researcher who insists on literal interpretations of Anunnaki texts finds their work rejected from major journals. Unable to publish, they can't build the publication record needed for tenure. Without tenure, they lack the security to continue controversial research. The system selects for conformity, without anyone needing to explicitly enforce it. Funding follows similar patterns. Major grants come from foundations and government agencies that rely on peer review panels to evaluate proposals. Those panels consist of established scholars with conventional views. Research proposals exploring literal Anunnaki interpretations are rated as methodologically unsound or historically naive. The money goes elsewhere. Some researchers who maintained alternative readings did receive funding, but from outside the mainstream academic system. This immediately marked their work as suspect. Serious scholars don't need private donors, the logic goes. The fact that mainstream institutions refused to fund such research became evidence that it wasn't serious research. This isn't conspiracy. It's how paradigms protect themselves. Thomas Kuhn documented this pattern across scientific revolutions. Established frameworks don't fall because of evidence. They fall when the generation that built them retires, and younger scholars adopt new approaches. Until then, institutions defend their paradigms through entirely normal academic processes. Textbooks reflect this control perfectly. They're written by small committees of established scholars, drawing on a limited pool of sources, citing each other's work in circular fashion. A textbook author consults the major journals, finds consistent interpretations, and presents those as settled fact. Students learn these interpretations, eventually become scholars themselves, and perpetuate the same frameworks. Meanwhile, the original translations from the 1800s sit in restricted library collections. They're not destroyed or hidden. They're just not taught. A determined researcher could find them, but you have to know they exist to look for them. And if no one mentions them in modern scholarship, how would you know? At the British Museum, unrestricted access to the full Sumerian tablet collection requires special permission granted to senior researchers. There are perhaps 47 people worldwide with this level of access. They trained under a handful of professors who themselves studied under an even smaller group. The chain of academic descent is remarkably concentrated. These gatekeepers aren't villains. Most genuinely believe they're protecting scholarship from pseudoscience and maintaining rigorous standards. But the effect is the same as if they were actively suppressing alternative views. The gates stay closed, the consensus holds, and interpretations that challenge the paradigm remain safely outside. Understanding why requires understanding what was at stake. The literal Anunnaki narrative didn't just challenge academic theories. It threatened foundational stories that multiple powerful institutions had built their authority upon. Consider what accepting the tablets at face value would mean. Humans weren't the pinnacle of natural evolution. We were a genetically modified species created to serve others' purposes. That single claim undermines human exceptionalism, the idea that we're unique in the cosmos, special by nature, or divine selection. Religious institutions built their theology on specific creation narratives. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism all teach that humans were created by God in His image, granted dominion over earth, endowed with souls that make us fundamentally different from animals. The Anunnaki story suggests something else. Genetic engineering, biological manipulation, creation for utilitarian purposes. These aren't compatible narratives. One has to be wrong. Scientific institutions faced similar threats. Evolutionary biology traces human development through natural selection over millions of years. The Anunnaki narrative doesn't necessarily contradict evolution, but it adds an external intervention factor that mainstream science isn't equipped to accommodate. If advanced beings genetically modified early hominids, that's still evolution in a sense, but it's directed rather than natural. It requires rewriting textbooks, revising timelines, admitting that our understanding of human origins is incomplete. The concept of historical progress was equally threatened. Victorian-era thinking, which still shapes modern assumptions, sees history as a line of constant advancement from primitive to sophisticated. This narrative justified colonialism, advanced Europeans helping backward peoples, and supported industrial capitalism's promise of inevitable improvement. But if history is cyclical rather than linear, if advanced civilizations rose and fell before recorded history, if knowledge was possessed and lost and painstakingly recovered, then progress isn't guaranteed. Civilizations can collapse. Knowledge can be forgotten. What we call advancement might be relearning what our ancestors knew. This was philosophically and politically unacceptable in the early 20th century, when Western institutions were heavily invested in the progress narrative. Accepting cyclical history meant accepting that everything could be lost, that advancement wasn't inevitable, that perhaps current civilization wasn't as secure as it seemed. There were practical concerns too. Universities and museums had invested decades and enormous resources into specific archaeological frameworks. Their collections were organized chronologically. Their curricula were structured around developmental stages. Their published scholarship built upon established timelines. Accepting that these timelines were fundamentally wrong would devalue existing collections, invalidate published research, and require wholesale reorganization of academic programs. It would mean admitting that generations of scholars had misunderstood the evidence. Institutions rarely embrace that kind of comprehensive error admission. The economic investment was substantial. Publishing houses had profitable textbook series based on established narratives. Museums attracted visitors with exhibits telling specific stories about human development. Universities filled classrooms with courses teaching accepted chronologies. Changing the narrative would require reprinting textbooks, redesigning exhibits, restructuring courses, expensive and disruptive changes. Nationalism added another layer. The early 20th century saw nations building identity around origin stories. If civilization was taught by external beings rather than developed independently, it undermined claims of national or racial superiority. Greeks couldn't claim unique genius if knowledge came from outside. Neither could Egyptians, Chinese, or Europeans. Everyone would be equally recipients of gifted knowledge. The threat wasn't to one institution or one narrative, but to multiple interlocking frameworks that supported each other and provided foundation for religious, scientific, political, and economic systems. The solution wasn't to destroy evidence. That would be too obvious and create martyrs. The solution was reinterpretation. Change how the texts are read. Shift from literal to symbolic. Transform historical claims into mythology, not through lies but through methodological choices about how to translate, what context to emphasize, which interpretations to teach. The erasure was protective rather than malicious. Institutions protecting their paradigms, their investments, their authority, their foundational narratives. They weren't necessarily hiding truth. They were defending everything they'd built on the assumption that certain things couldn't be true. But sometimes what can't be true is simply what we can't afford to accept. Physical evidence has a way of becoming inconvenient. When objects tell stories that don't fit accepted narratives, those objects have a tendency to vanish, not dramatically, not all at once, but through the quiet mechanisms of institutional control. The Baghdad Museum looting in 2003 is remembered for its chaos. During the early days of the Iraq War, the museum was ransacked. Thousands of artifacts disappeared in what was widely reported as random criminal opportunism. Except the pattern of what vanished wasn't quite random. Items of obvious monetary value, golden jewelry, precious stones, ornate vessels, many of those were eventually recovered. Looters sold them. Authorities tracked them down. Museums quietly reacquired them. But certain tablets, certain cylinder seals, certain artifacts depicting what appeared to be technological devices or detailed interactions between the Anunnaki and early humans, those remain missing. No black market sales. No recovery operations. Just gone. This wasn't the first time Anunnaki-related artifacts disappeared. The pattern extends back decades. In 1932, German archaeologists working near Babylon excavated an object that shouldn't have existed. Photographs show a mechanism containing bronze gears arranged in complex patterns, surrounded by astronomical symbols. The device was catalogued as item IM64723 and shipped to the Baghdad Museum for study. The catalogue entry is still there. The photograph exists in the German Archaeological Society's archives. The device itself was marked in restoration in 1935, then storage location unknown by 1938, and eventually removed from active inventory entirely. No one can explain what happened to it. Records show it was never officially deaccessioned, never transferred to another institution, never destroyed in any documented incident. It simply ceased to exist in any accessible location. Cylinder seals from 1920s excavations near Ur show similarly curious disappearances. Several seals depicted unusual aerial perspectives of landscapes. Views from above showing city layouts, irrigation patterns, geographical features in ways that shouldn't be possible without flight or elevated observation. Early excavation reports described and photographed these seals. Modern museum catalogues list them as lost during administrative transitions or archival reorganization. The Ubaid lizard figurines present a different kind of vanishing. Not physical disappearance, but categorical obscurity. These strange statuettes depict humanoid figures with distinctly reptilian features. Elongated heads, large eyes, scaled skin. Some show these figures holding infants, nursing children, performing domestic tasks. They're acknowledged by archaeology, occasionally displayed in minor exhibits, but rarely discussed in detail. The curious aspect is how they're presented. Museum placards describe them as ritual objects or mythological representations, but the figurines show no indication of ritual purpose. They're not positioned ceremonially, not associated with temple context, not decorated with religious symbolism. They look domestic, ordinary, as if depicting actual beings performing mundane activities. These artifacts remain physically accessible, but interpretively buried. You can see them if you visit the right museums. but you'll learn nothing useful from the official descriptions. The possibility that they might represent actual species, actual beings that coexisted with early humans, that interpretation remains professionally unthinkable. Metallurgical samples present similar patterns. Bronze Age artifacts containing alloy combinations that require sophisticated temperature control and material knowledge that supposedly didn't exist yet. When such samples were first analyzed in the early 20th century, researchers published papers noting the anomalies. Modern museum collections still hold these artifacts, but they're categorized in ways that obscure their significance. Filed under ceremonial objects or trade goods, with the unusual metallurgy noted briefly, if at all. Private collectors who acquired Anunnaki-related artifacts faced interesting pressures. Legal claims emerged asserting state ownership. International heritage laws were invoked. In several documented cases, collectors who resisted surrendering artifacts faced protracted legal battles that ended with forced transfers to national museums, where the objects promptly disappeared into archive storage. The pattern is consistent enough to be noticeable, subtle enough to be deniable. Artifacts supporting conventional interpretations, purely religious artifacts, clearly mythological representations, objects that fit established timelines. These remain on display, well documented, accessible to researchers. Artifacts suggesting technological sophistication, physical reality of the Anunnaki, advanced knowledge in impossibly early periods. These become lost, archived, restricted, or reinterpreted into obscurity. Nothing is destroyed. That would leave evidence of suppression. Instead, inconvenient objects are simply managed into irrelevance through the bureaucratic machinery of institutional control. Catalogued, but inaccessible. Acknowledged, but unexplained. Existing, but invisible. The evidence hasn't vanished entirely. It's been carefully placed where most people won't find it, and where those who do find it lack the authority to make others pay attention. Some places remain unexcavated, not because they're unknown or inaccessible, but because someone decided they should stay that way. Eridu sits in southern Iraq, identified in Sumerian tablets as the first city, the place where kingship descended from heaven, where the Anunnaki established their initial presence on Earth. Early excavations in the 1940s and 1950s uncovered massive temple complexes built on an unprecedented scale. The architecture showed features that puzzled archaeologists: advanced hydraulic systems, acoustic properties suggesting sophisticated engineering, foundation structures that seemed designed for far greater weight than the buildings they supported. Then, the excavations stopped. Not because the site was fully explored. Barely 10% had been touched. Not because funding dried up. Eridu's significance guaranteed interest. The work simply halted, and the site has remained largely untouched for over 60 years, despite being arguably the most important location in early Mesopotamian history. Official explanations cite political instability, changing research priorities, preservation concerns, but nearby sites of lesser significance continued receiving excavation permits and funding throughout the same periods. The Abzu presents an even more curious case. Ancient texts describe it as Enki's underground dwelling, a place beneath Eridu, where the Anunnaki maintained facilities. Most scholars treat this as pure mythology, symbolic language for the underworld or subconscious. But in 1988, ground-penetrating radar surveys detected a massive underground structure beneath the Eridu site, a complex of chambers and passages extending deep into the earth, too regular to be natural formations. The Iraqi government approved excavation permits. International funding was arranged. Then the international archaeological boards intervened, denying permits based on preservation protocols. The stated concern was that excavating might destabilize existing structures. Yet similar underground excavations proceeded at other sites where no such concerns were raised. The radar data was published in a specialized journal, noted briefly, then forgotten. The structure remains unexcavated, its nature unknown, its existence barely acknowledged in mainstream archaeological literature. After the Gulf Wars, entire swaths of southern Iraq became effectively off-limits to archaeological research. Military zones, areas deemed too dangerous, regions where permits are perpetually denied for security reasons. Satellite imagery shows clear structural outlines at multiple Sumerian sites. Geometric patterns suggesting buildings, walls, organized settlements. But ground access remains restricted. The pattern appears elsewhere. Baalbek in Lebanon contains foundation stones weighing over 800 tons, precisely cut and fitted, moved by methods unknown. The most massive stones lie in sections of the site that remain unexcavated. Proposals to explore these areas face bureaucratic obstacles. Permits are delayed, denied, or granted with restrictions so severe they make meaningful work impossible. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, already the oldest known megalithic site, has been excavated only 5%. Ground-penetrating radar shows the explored structures are merely the surface of a much larger complex. Yet excavation proceeds at a glacial pace, with large sections declared off-limits for preservation reasons. A curious priority, given that the site survived 12,000 years buried and faces more danger from exposure than from careful excavation. What's particularly interesting is when restrictions come not from host governments, but from international archaeological organizations. Citing preservation ethics, these bodies can effectively veto excavations, even when local authorities approve. The criteria for these decisions aren't always transparent. Some sites face strict preservation protocols, while nearby locations are excavated extensively. The result is a landscape of forbidden knowledge, not hidden in the sense of being unknown, but in the sense of being deliberately unexamined. We know where these sites are. We have technology to explore them remotely. We understand their potential significance, but access is controlled, permits are denied, and the evidence remains safely buried. Not destroyed, not lost, just kept in place, underground, where it can't complicate the established narrative, where it can't force uncomfortable questions or require revision of carefully maintained timelines. The Earth itself has become an archive with restricted access, and the restrictions serve the same function as locked library doors, keeping certain knowledge safely away from those who might use it to challenge what we've agreed to believe. The Vatican Apostolic Archives, formerly the Vatican Secret Archives, renamed in 2019, though the content remains largely the same, stretch for 53 miles of shelving beneath Vatican City. Only a fraction has been catalogued for public awareness. Less has been made available to outside scholars. The Catholic Church accumulated texts from across the ancient world through centuries of crusades, colonial missions, and archaeological enterprises. When European powers excavated Mesopotamian sites in the 19th and early 20th centuries, significant portions of discoveries were donated to the Church as patron of the expeditions. Transfer records document Sumerian tablets entering Vatican possession, particularly during the 1920s when European institutions competed for Near Eastern artifacts. Accessing these archives requires more than academic credentials. Researchers must obtain specific ecclesiastical approval, demonstrate acceptable purposes for their research, and can only view materials pre-approved by church archivists. The approval process can take years. Many requests are simply denied without detailed explanation. The Church has historical precedent for restricting texts that challenge biblical chronology. The Gospel of Judas remained hidden for centuries. Gnostic texts were suppressed for millennia. Documents that offered alternative accounts of early Christianity, different interpretations of divine nature, competing creation narratives. These were consistently restricted, archived, or destroyed. In 1994, a Jesuit archaeologist named Father Alessandro de Mirgi, working in the Vatican archives with special permission, mentioned in private correspondence that he'd translated 13 tablets describing genetic manipulation by beings called Anunnaki. The correspondence was never meant to be public. It emerged during an unrelated investigation. Shortly after, Father de Mirgi was transferred to a remote Franciscan monastery in Peru. The tablets he'd referenced were moved to a section of the archives requiring 3 separate levels of permission from offices reporting directly to the papal administration. Attempts to verify this account run into predictable obstacles. The Vatican neither confirms nor denies the existence of specific tablets. Father de Mirgi declined all interview requests before his death in 2008. The monastery where he spent his final years keeps no records of scholarly work he may have conducted there. Similar patterns appear in other religious archives. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints maintains extensive genealogical records, some dating to periods and regions overlapping with early Mesopotamian civilization. Portions of these archives remain restricted to church researchers. The stated reason is privacy protection for living descendants, though this doesn't explain restrictions on texts thousands of years old. Russian Orthodox archives contain materials from Soviet-era archaeological expeditions in Mesopotamia and Central Asia. During the Cold War, Soviet archaeologists conducted extensive work in regions where Anunnaki tablets originated. Their findings were documented in Russian-language journals with limited circulation. After the Soviet collapse, many of these materials were transferred to church archives rather than state museums. Access requires permission from ecclesiastical authorities, who rarely grant it to foreign researchers. Private collections held by esoteric societies add another layer of inaccessibility. Freemasonic libraries, Rosicrucian archives, private antiquities collections. These hold materials acquired through channels outside academic archaeology. Catalogues hint at Sumerian tablets, cylinder seals, and texts referencing pre-flood civilizations, but verification is impossible without access. That's granted only to initiated members. What makes this particularly frustrating is that we know these materials exist. Catalogue references survive. Transfer records document acquisitions. Researchers who gained temporary access left notes before their access was revoked. The evidence isn't gone. It's locked behind institutional walls that have proven remarkably durable against transparency. Religious institutions justify restrictions by citing sacred obligations, preservation concerns, protection of sensitive materials. But the pattern of what gets restricted and what remains accessible suggests other priorities. Texts supporting conventional religious narratives circulate freely. Those challenging foundational stories about human origins, divine creation, or historical chronology remain perpetually archived. The Vatican could open these archives tomorrow. Technology exists to digitize and distribute ancient texts globally. Academic interest is enormous. The knowledge would advance understanding of early civilizations significantly. But institutions don't surrender control easily, especially when that control protects narratives central to their authority. So the miles of shelving remain dim, climate-controlled, and inaccessible. The knowledge sits in darkness, not destroyed, but functionally erased, available in theory, but impossible to access in practice. Truth preserved but hidden, documented but suppressed, existing but invisible to those who might challenge what we've been taught to believe.